Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Regardless of where you are in the world, we are so glad that you're joining us to discuss MRO materials management. Welcome. I'm Christine Barnhart, and I'm the VP of Strategy and Go-to-Market at Verison, a supply chain intelligence platform. But I actually bring with me over 20 years of engineering, manufacturing, and supply chain experience. And I'm really hopeful that that will help me gain additional insights from our two esteemed panelists. First, I'm happy to introduce Ben Finley. Ben is the CEO of Machine Compare, a digital marketplace that sells machinery to help reduce the waste across supply chains. He is based out of the UK and is an industry leader, remains very focused on driving a new era of change for customers, the planet, and the future of innovation. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks very much for having us.
I'd also like to introduce Baljeet Balina. He is with Verison, and he is one of our industry advisors. He's also a sourcing leader with just a wealth of industry experience spanning pulp and paper, packaging, consumer products, aerospace, and healthcare. He's currently helping us at Verison help global supply chains address their MRO materials management. Welcome, Baljeet.
Thank you, Christine.
So we're pretty informal in terms of webinars. If you have questions as we go through this session, please feel free to submit them into the Q&A function. We'll either address them as they come, depending upon the topic, or some we may hold till the end of the session. But please, we definitely want to hear from you. We want this to be engaging and conversational. So I think where we want to start is first with a really big thank you to both of you. I know that you are super busy, but I think your insights and what you see in the industry will be really helpful to the people that are logging in with us. And I think, you know, when we look at the first quarter of 2022, I think we went into it with a lot of hope that supply chains were going to normalize, whatever that means. But it definitely hasn't been easy. The war in Ukraine, surging COVID cases in China and now throughout the world, and a trucking blockade at the US southern border, they've added just yet another layer of disruption to the global flow of goods and services. So Ben, I understand that you've actually visited the Ukraine and some other conflict zones a few years back, and you still keep in contact with individuals in the Ukrainian corrugated sector. Would you mind just sharing a little bit about your experience and from your perspective, how the war has impacted the current state of supply chain?
Yeah, absolutely, Christine. So I was there about 7 years ago now, during the last conflict with Russia. I'd say that just to kind of frame why I was there, it wasn't any kind of underhanded reason I was there, but basically I was on a project for Nestle out in eastern Ukraine in Kharkiv, and then I was a lot further down south towards Donetsk. The conflict at that point, and I think it's really clear, it's really important to differentiate between a conflict and a war. At that point, it was armies fighting armies. So you could be in a place and there could be conflict happening maybe a quarter of a mile away. At no point is any civilian at risk. Whereas what you've got now is just horrific. It's just the human loss is awful. So yeah, I'm still in touch with a lot of the companies that I was dealing with over there, and I've got a lot of friends there as well. Unfortunately, the ones I was in touch with in Kharkiv have all left for obvious reasons. I've got a friend of mine that's further south in, and I'm going to pronounce it wrong, is Dnipro, which is, I think it's the third largest city in Ukraine. So he's further south. I think he's about an hour and a half away from Mariupol, hour and a half away from Donetsk. So he's kind of, he was, I haven't spoke to him this week, but he was definitely the last man standing in relation to manufacturing over there. And he was sort of explaining a lot of the issues that he was having. And, you know, I've been trying to help as much as I can by letting people know what's going on and see how it's going to impact. But I think if you look at the economic landscape in Ukraine right now, it's absolutely shot to pieces in obviously more ways than one. It's a real wartime economy. So what you generally get is hyperinflation. You also have a big issue in regards to resources. So if we talk about him in particular, and he deals with box making, packaging is a really good barometer to the rest of the economy, because everything comes in a cardboard box, right? You know, whether it's agriculture or parts or whatever it is that you're dealing with. So his big issue is he's suffering with supply chain issues in regards to just being able to get goods to him, like natural resources. So paper, you can't get paper delivered. They'd had, I think, the largest paper mill over there, which was, I believe it might have been a DS Smith plant that was bombed or set on fire. They can't get stuff in. It's just at the beginning of what was going on, there were lots of sort of army Russian troops that were shooting people that were delivering goods across the country. So that was also making it very, very difficult. I think difficult is an understatement of just being able to move things around. So yeah, it's an absolute nightmare. The biggest issue for them though is that their economy is not going to recover, and it's not going to recover quickly. You know, the main thing that happened is all the women and children left, and a lot of the big export goods that are used from Ukraine generally rely on that labor force. If you look at wheat, you're looking at it's mainly women that go out and pick or do anything, but they've missed the sort of seeding season now as well. So if you took wheat in particular and said, well, you know, wheat's been disrupted, it's not just disrupted for a year. If they start everything back up again, if the war finishes tomorrow, you're looking at a 2-year disruption for those sorts of goods. Anything to do with agriculture, immediately it's 2 years worth of disruption. And then you have on top of that is obviously you take a paper mill out the market, that's one aspect. So it's a commodity, the price of that increases. If you tie that in with sanctions that are going on with Russia, Russia makes a lot of craft paper, although it doesn't supply the world in an inordinate way. It's uncertainty in the market, so it's a commodity. Anything to do with these commodities where you've got disruption, you will see price increases. So it's inflationary, and that has a ripple effect across the rest of the world. So you'll be feeling price increases in the US. We're feeling them in the UK, and then also when we get into our sort of sector where we're dealing with spare parts, the steel, the nickel, and those kind of exports that Ukraine does. It's a country that's very rich in natural resources. That will also have a knock-on effect. But I mean, their economy currently is just it's not going to recover quickly. And if the war ends tomorrow, it's still not going to make any difference. This is going to, I would hope the war ends tomorrow, but this is going to affect everybody for a few years to come, on top of COVID, on top of everything else. We live in a very interesting time, but I think we live in a great time to be alive. But it's certainly not easy for a lot of people, is it? So yeah.
No, it isn't, especially for supply chain professionals that are, really tasked with keeping things moving regardless of what's happening in the world. And that's just, you having been connected, I think, being able to help us understand not just the supply chain side of the tragedy, but first and foremost, the human tragedy. We really appreciate that, Ben. So for those that may not be really familiar, haven't traveled a lot or whatnot, is it fair for my compatriots here in the US to say, Mexico, Latin America into South America is a bit of the low cost region, if you will, for US component assembly and things of that nature. Ukraine, Poland, kind of that Eastern Bloc really functions in the same capacity for Europe, correct?
To a degree, but I think so I've been to Mexico, and I think that you've got cheap labor there. Ukraine, I think it's really, really important to frame this, is that these Eastern Bloc countries maybe would have been cheap labor previously, but if you look at what's gone on in the last 10 years, they've really developed. So if you went to Ukraine, it's a very, very modern country. They're very, very well educated. Their economy it's not a poor economy. It's not a developing world. It is a developed world economy. You've also got a lot of other resources there. They're very heavy on the tech sector. So there's lots of developers that go on in there. There's a lot of other stuff. So it's not a poor country. And when you drive around, you're dealing with like really nice new roads. Obviously, what they were trying to do was get themselves up to a level where they could become European. So I suppose for Europe, maybe it's marginally less, but it's not it's not a poor country, it is a developed country, and it's a country that,
Right.
that again, its export with natural resources is quite high. I think that's also why it's such a target for Russia, because Europe's quite heavily reliant on Russia for oil and gas, especially Germany that's built the pipeline there because they're trying to get away from fossil fuels. So they've exported their fossil fuel production to Russia. Ukraine as well it's part of that. It's part of being able to supply Europe with natural resource. So I think if you suddenly sort of take Ukraine out the equation, I think that Russia knows that the pressure that's going to be felt by the rest of Europe, and then the knock-on effect by the rest of the world, is going to be quite severe. Obviously, we can talk about supply chain issues and how that affects us, because ultimately you don't want to sideline the fact that people are actually dying. It's horrific, and it's
Right.
that war is horrific. But there's also that aspect of a lot of people will look at what's going on there and say it's really bad. I'll donate like $20 to the charity donation, but how does that really affect me? I think it's really important for people to understand how that affects them, how that's going to affect their businesses, and how that's going to affect things moving forward, because then there's more pressure to make change happen and hopefully either support the Ukrainians or bring peace or bring people to the table to talk, and that's kind of it. But yeah, I think comparison to Mexico maybe, but I haven't been to Mexico for probably 10 years, so I wouldn't be able to make the direct comparison. But I wouldn't want to frame Ukraine as being a developing country. It's really, when you go there, it's really nice, or it was. It certainly won't be the same now. Yeah.
So I actually think that's a really great segue, because Baljeet, I know in your role, you're working really closely with prospects and customers of Veresen. And I'm assuming that through that, you've seen kind of the impacts that they're feeling as well. Could you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, thanks, Christine. And actually, I want to thank everybody who's attending on the webinar first. And I'm pleased, to be on the panel. And I can relate to what Ben said, kind of thing, to me is, think about this one as, I think this one was a human nature instinct, right? As soon as some natural disaster, either it's a war or a pandemic or weather happens, what do? We basically take an example of a grocery store, right? All the shelves are cleared, we stock up, and, we panic. That's what happens. So similar happens on the MRO supply chain too. It's a panic buy. So what happened in the short term, prices goes up, shortage of products start happening, and it disrupts the normal supply chain and fulfillment cycle, not just at the consumer level, but because the distributor level as well as the manufacturer level. So that's what happened. I'll give you a good example. As soon as the war in Ukraine happened, oil prices went up. Okay, everybody's like, okay, fine, oil prices are going up. We need to negate some oil pricing. We need to do something. So the focus shifts on the production of oil. And what happened was that by the byproducts of, comes up, which basically start the allocation of greases and lubricants. So for example, there's a high temperature grease used in industrial, production areas, HHC 660. I'll even give you the example that went from like 48-hour lead time to 6 weeks back order. Okay, that's what started happening. So what people start thinking, buy more, get it for. So when that happens, prices goes up. They don't even care what happened in the prices, right? So that's the short-term panic stuff happen, but it's cost in longer term, what it does. It creates a bullwhip and a ripple effect, as Ben said earlier. It's going to start creating a ripple effect, and it leaves permanent pricing impact. I'll give you a good example. Before COVID-19 hits, nitrile gloves, a box of 100 gloves was selling for like $2 to $3 in US. Once the COVID hit, because of the shortage supply, because of all the quality issues, everything, it went from like somewhere from $30 to $45 of a box. Okay. Now the supply has, demand and supply has kind of balanced it. It has eased down a little bit, but pricing is still around $18 to $20 a box. It's never going to come down to $2 or $3 in the longer term. It's going to leave permanent mark. Maybe like Ben said, it might take 10 years. So that's what's going to happen. So it disrupts the different, and it's going to disrupt the different product market in a lagging manner. as Ben said, agriculture first, maybe then the paper, the boxes. So it's going to, like Wall Street Journal last week basically said there was an article in the Wall Street last week about Ukraine war is now going to start impacting the Asian countries. And once the Asian countries' production start interrupting, it's going to start basically have a ripple effect going in product delays in other markets. And it's going to be a ripple effect coming up due to longer docking time, labor shortages, longer lead times, and it's going to cause unplanned shutdown and unplanned. And that's going to cause, but that could be a lagging manner, which users might not realize for another 6 months to a year at least. Okay, so it's all about risk optimization and financial, either it's financial or operational, right? Sometimes we say, okay, yeah, build more inventory, or you're tying a lot of working capital in there, or operational. So what I'm trying to summarize here basically in this one is, so again, high prices and fuel logistic charges causing higher prices right now. And some companies will shift because it's creating a variance against their budgets, right? So they will shift basically to like a failure mode or run until it fails. And that's going to cause a lot more unplanned outages and everything. And that's basically more risk, or I want to carry more inventory on hand. So it's all about risk optimization. It's also going to cause, because of the panic buying upfront in shorter term, going to cause overstock in inventory due to market panic or shortage long, and that's basically going to come up later because now it's sitting over there not used, and it's either slow turning or it might not be used for another 2-3 years, and it's going to start turning into obsolete. And also, some companies that I've seen is they will adjust min-max levels right away, up higher. What it does is basically increase the risk in the longer term because a lot of companies, once the min-max are adjusted, they don't revisit another 6 months or a year, another. And that's creating a wool bip and again within the distribution channels. So that's what my question of the day basically, and this one comes up to everybody is, how do you overcome this challenge strategically where short-term challenges have created longer term? And that's, I think, where, machine compare, Verizon, and especially Verizon platform comes in play. And we can talk a little bit detail later, is where we provide those insights and basically we try to help companies optimize the risk, basically. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, Baljit.
Thank you.
So, I think, all this added risk and these new disruptions are definitely a supply chain management professional's worst nightmare. So what I'm hearing is, be prepared. We're going to have more shortages. We're going to have longer lead times. We're going to have higher prices for critical supplies, but these are all things that we really need to keep production lines running. And I really do think that one area of operations that many organizations continue to overlook is the risk and the potential to optimize MRO. And so I was reading a Boston Consulting Group article, and it said that MRO spending, which is both the services and the spare parts, ranges from the low side of about 0.5% to the high side of as much as 5% of revenues. It's very industry, dependent. But in all industries, what they see is that poorly managed MRO processes really mean unnecessarily high cost, low productivity on both the plant operation side and the worker side, and in many cases, poor product quality, which is really bad, and elevated inventory holding cost. So I think, hopefully at least the three of us, we can agree that it's really important to have the right maintenance and repair parts on hand, as we see both risk and inflation continuing to rise. So Ben, based on your experience, what are some of the biggest challenges or the most common challenges that you're seeing in the MRO space?
I think the biggest challenge, hands down, is data. It's just data because, just to add that, I think that it's estimated that 7%, there's supposed to be an estimated 7% a year increase as well, on top of the numbers that you've said on MRO spend and for spare parts too. And if you look at the current climate, what Baljit's just said, it's going to keep increasing. But the problem that a lot of companies have is just that their internal data is a mess. It's a mess, and I think most big companies that we speak to will privately admit that to us. You also have a big thing about looking at how companies in those sectors grow as well. So a lot of companies, especially when times are becoming tough right now, they will grow through acquisition. And when you start growing through acquisition, you're also taking over other people's ERP systems. There are other stock level management systems. They've got different material codes, and it doesn't get any better. And the big issue with this is it's not humanly possible to try and fix this issue. You need to have, and it's not just there's not just one approach that you need to take with this. You need to take all approaches. Their data needs to be harmonized. The material codes need to conform. Once it's been conformed and you kind of optimized and said, well, look, these material codes are here and we know what we have and this is what we actually use, and we should start to become a bit more intelligent about where we place our stock. You also need to enrich that data further. So we come in at that point, we can help with the enrichment of the data where you can add attributes, because it might be that you have a part that you can't get. Maybe it's obsolete, maybe it's a rebranded part from another manufacturer. So a machinery manufacturer might rebrand, say, an Allen Bradley product and say it's their own. If they can't supply that through supply chain disruption because Allen Bradley have suddenly got an extremely long lead time, which I think we all know never happens. Of course that happens, that's absolutely happening right now. Then if you could search for that product based on attribute rather than based on brand, that will also help you exhaust your internal data, because you need to exhaust what you've got, you need to know what you've got, and then when you realize what you don't need, that's where we step in, and then you start to try and put that out into the open market and start to look in other people's stores. Because I think if we take this as a very basic, or even if you look at it as a patriotic aspect, where the East against the West, where maybe Russia's doing this, we tie this back, is that we have to have a wartime mentality about all of this, because the supply chain issues are not going to be solved. So the only way that we will solve it is if we all work together in order to find the solutions. And one of that is, let's understand what we have. Let's understand what we don't need. Let's understand what we can use. Let's understand what we can't use. And what we can't use and what we don't need, let's let other people not have it. I mean, you can sell it, and let's open our stores up, because there's no real threat here. The real threat is that you can't produce. It's all inflationary. You can't get your product out the door. There's less products leaving. Transport becomes more expensive, packaging becomes more expensive. Before your goods even get to the customer, you'll see a 30-40% price increase just because of supply chain disruption, which then has a knock-on effect for actual production. So if we all work together, the solutions are there to certainly ease some of the pressure, maybe not solve everything, but ease some of the pressure. And I think it's just being intelligent about it. The last sort of 6 or 7 years, you've seen huge digital transformations happening. I mean, when we first started looking for these kind of green spare parts in companies which are unused, still in the box, there was still a lot of the ERP systems hadn't fully been integrated. People weren't fully using them. They didn't really know what they had. There's no excuse now. It's there. People have them. The issue is about getting their data up to a good standard and letting the systems take care of themselves, so that you can then capitalize on that aspect. So I think that's where the partnership comes in really, really nicely with us. We complement each other quite well. But I'll let you ask more questions, because my wife says I can definitely talk a glass eye to sleep.
Ben, it's interesting. I actually started my career right out of engineering school in maintenance for Whirlpool. And what's been interesting for me over the last 20 some odd years is to see how much things have not changed, and how much technology is not being leveraged in that space. So, I think Baljit, I'm going to kind of turn that over to you. Why do you think that so many organizations have really overlooked the opportunity to optimize within that MRO space?
So actually, it's a good discussion, kind of topic on this one, because as you said earlier, MRO, from a supply chain standpoint, as a professional, what I look at as a spender, it's about single digit spend of the total external spend of a company, but and then in turn, storeroom inventory itself is about 30 to 40% of that MRO inventory. So it's very, very small, and usually sometimes it's not the focus. Okay. And I have led many of these projects in my past career, with this one. So question comes in, if you go on the operation floor and ask a maintenance person or an operation person, because those are the people who basically are deciding what parts to keep in the storeroom, right? You ask about the storeroom inventory. Generally, you're going to say is, I can't find the part when I need it. Okay. I don't know what storeroom carries or what is the total value on hand. Okay. I don't have visibility to other plants' inventory within my own company. Okay. And I'm responsible to keep the machine running. So if I need a part, I'm always available. Okay. And when some of these projects happen and storeroom pushes the maintenance people to get rid of some of the parts, what happened? They're not comfortable that they're going to find a part in the middle of the night in the storeroom because storeroom got rid of them. So what they do is they start keeping the parts next to the machine or in their own office as a satellite inventory. Okay. And you know what that causes? That causes two things. One is, or they start buying directly. Okay. What happened then is, now you have an inventory expense, but not used. So it's mismatching against your revenues in the right period. And also your safety stock in the storeroom, if it's sitting there as not turning and collecting dirt and becoming obsolete while you keep on buying directly. And most of this, what my experience has been, a lot of times this happens in electrical and automation type of categories where the technology upgrades and shelf life is smaller, it changes so frequently. This happens why? Because these users don't have a confidence, because majority of the companies have many disparate ERP systems, multiple folks entering or searching in different ways, human nature. Two people will not type the same thing a different way. I can give you the example of a bearing I always use for last 15 years as an example to provide example. 6204 2RS JEM. Long MPN number, but ball bearing, 10-inch ball bearing. If you ask two people to enter the part number, some will enter 6204 space 2 space RS JEM, some will together, some will only type 6204 2RS, right? So a lot of times these ERP systems are not capable of those fuzzy search or creating, and then it start creating duplicate because either they're going to buy it or they're going to create another material ID. And that's what goes back to Ben's question is, it all starts with data. It's all within the data, how the data is stored at the ERP systems. And that's where, can we do the standardized data? And I think we can talk a little more about this one, but I'll summarize this one is that's what's causing. It's all coming from the maintenance operation floor people, and they don't have the right tools or they don't have the confidence in storeroom that storeroom will have. But you ask them how much value is, 80% of them will guess underestimate the value that the storeroom carries. So it's all the risk again, going back to the risk optimization, how much risk you're willing to take to run your operations versus how much risk you willing to take financially to tie the money in the working capital. Okay, and one example I will give you, Christine, in this one is just a couple of months ago, one of our Verizon clients had a machine down, was searching the parts in the ERP system, couldn't find the part. They came back to Verizon platform, did the fuzzy search on their part, found that one of the sister plants has it, called the sister plant, overnight the plant, and according to the client, its own testimony, they basically were able to save over $1 million in lost time. They were able to save that downtime.
That's awesome. Such a great example. And I think for those of us that have, worked in a plant, you're really conscious of like every minute that a machine is down is costing you money, is a customer that's not getting what they need, is potential overtime. So great example. I really love it. And I think this is also a great opportunity to maybe focus a little bit more on the area of waste. So I think it's interesting. I think for 30 years, supply chains myopically focused on cost, right? And I think now what we're seeing is, yes, we we do want to make sure that we're not overly investing, but really it's more about not being wasteful and reducing risk. So Ben, could you maybe share with us how you've helped organizations reduce unnecessary waste via their spare parts and supply chain?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also to carry on with Banjit's point there is that we have a real focus on MRO. We have a focus on spare parts, on supply chain, but the reality is because that's the world that we sit in.
Right.
The company's objective is not spare parts. They're not spare parts companies. They make a product. So they care about production. And when you talk about spare parts and MRO, you have a build up there, which comes from an engineer's viewpoint, which is they're like Boy Scouts, always be prepared, because their job is keep the asset running, Overstock is a good thing. From an accountancy point of view, they can write off against it. It goes on as a depreciating asset. Sometimes it goes on as a business expense. So really, when we talk about waste, intrinsically, when we started out, people were saying, well, this doesn't have any value. It's all been written off. It's on the books for zero. We've got a moving price on this. It's not that important to us. It's only when we start digging. So we found within the customer sets that we work in, and this is a conservative estimate, is around 10 billion euros worth of these parts, and that's across Europe, North America, Central America, Middle East. We found it everywhere. We've actually identified that a mid-sized manufacturing site, regardless of sector, is carrying around €250,000 worth or $300,000 worth of these spare parts, and these are unused spare parts, still in the original packaging. They absolutely have a use. And if we take the view of a bearing doesn't really go off. If a bearing is 3 years old, it doesn't really impact its use as long as it's still in its original condition. I mean, yeah, if you've kept it in a bucket of water for 3 years, we might have something else to talk about, but that's not the case, because I know that if there's any people here that have been in an engineering stores, they are autistically clean. So you could eat the dinner off the most of the floors in those places, and they are organized. So I think from that perspective, this stuff is there. And like we said, it's our job is to try and recirculate these spare parts, because if we talk about waste, when we talk about waste within these companies, we know that most of these mid-sized plants usually scrap around €100,000 worth of these parts every year. And that's literally just to clear space, because new parts are coming in, the old parts need to go out. They kind of need to, they're all short on space. You never go to an engineering store that's half empty. That doesn't exist. I don't think that exists, So there's always stuff there, and our job really is to help recirculate them. And the big thing that it all falls down to is data. So if you optimize the stock, where we come in is we will take that stock once we've identified, it's non-moving parts older than 2 years old, remove all of your kind of critical spares, exhaust what you need to exhaust within the group, and then we can step in to then enrich that data, and we can then start to market that externally, because there's a very, very clear equation with good quality data sells. If you don't really know what it is, you're not going to buy it, and that's it. But fundamentally, the step before is harmonizing that data and getting that to us, so that we can then do our job, fully enrich it, add all the pictures, add all those attributes, and then start to market that to the rest of the world and start to help people. I don't know if that's answered your question. I definitely meandered quite a lot there. So,
no, I absolutely think it answered my question. And I think, it begs a better or a different question that I'm going to throw to Baljit, which is, okay, Baljit, like, I get it. There's opportunity within MRO. There's opportunity to better leverage the inventory that I have, potentially reduce that inventory, use it better across my organization. Why the heck can I just do that myself as some type of an internal project? What have you seen? Why would you say that there's a better way to do that?
So, historically, and again, within my 27 years of experience, I have done a few of them myself. What I've seen is, Christine, is every company goes through the review like every 3 to 5 years when somebody start looking at the balance sheet, book value of inventory. Oh my God, we got so much buildup. We need to do something, and sometimes it's a little bit too late. And, they start a one-time project to review projects, and then these approaches are like, time consuming. You're going to hire a third party basically to do the data cleanse, and there's pre-acquisition data cleanse, and the pre-acquisition of min-max adjustment, policies, etc. It's costly. Sometimes the companies charge you $1.10, $1.50 per record to, even just to standardize it. And it's not even clean that data, then it's ineffective because it takes too long. And by the time the data comes back, because it's been transferred in Excel files and other EDF formats, your current data is already outdated and it's already changed. So you have to start over again, kind of thing, And a lot of times, stocking attributes, lead times, criticality, min-maxes were set up during the initial material ID setup, and never touched again when the market around these, product ID have changed drastically, right? So I always say this one is that, as Ben said earlier, totally 100%, 110% aligned with Ben. The data inventory is a data point telling us about a company's health, internal processes, and most of them don't even know what to do with it until it's too late. Especially parts that are slow moving due to technology upgrade or shelf life. I will give you another example. A lot of time people don't realize. Look at in a production, a V-belt made from rubber, right? It's a low dollar, not that much expensive, hanging out. But a lot of people don't realize the V-belt has about 6 years of shelf life if stored in less than 85 degrees Fahrenheit temperature and less than 70% of the humidity. Again, 6 years is from the time it's manufactured, okay? A lot of time, what we look at the data, the time when we got it from into our storeroom. It might have been sitting for another 2 years at the distribution or the manufacturer. We don't consider that. And then how many, mills or manufacturing pulp and paper mills, consumer mills, have the environmental control where these V-belts are sitting in the right amount, especially in the summer? Not really, right? So we don't realize that. But that's kind of the insights, some of these companies hit the legacy projects of those companies does not provide. They basically standardize your data, send you the min-maxes, but they don't look at that data. And that's where, it's because users don't have the data points on their hands when they try to do internally, and that's why we failed. And that's why I failed it a couple of times myself too when I tried to do it, because for example, SAP, all that information might be in SAP, was hidden in different screens or different tables. It's not available on one screenshot where I can make the decision and look at the data. So that's the challenge, how to get ahead and reduce material waste and optimize based on the requirements, right? So I'll give you my personal belief is, I usually always challenge my sourcing and maintenance operation guys is, if a material is moving more than 4 to 5 times. I'll just give you one strategy there. If it's moving more than 4 or 5 times a year, it's off the shelf type of product. It's rarely available by the distributors, has shorter lead times. Why are you carrying it on your books? Right? Different insights, right? So that's where my personal bias towards Verison is, because Verison, I think, is the only single platform which provides those material management insights to help support the management strategy and risk optimization, because risk optimization doesn't mean reduce the inventory down. In some cases, you might have to say, increase your inventory because you're carrying too low and market condition has changed. My early example of greases, right? We might have to store it a little bit higher initially right now. On the other side, talking with the waste, you have those V-belts sitting, if they're not moving, the slow moving inventory sometime is going to turn into obsolete. How do we use those insights and then partner with, machine compare and to help you basically, realize some value of the part before it becomes obsolete. And that's, I think, the value of where some machine compare partnership comes into place.
Yeah. So it's interesting because we actually did have a question from a guest that was actually asking us about our position on the proper storage of rubber goods, which you actually addressed in there, which I think rubber goods, things that are petroleum based, are really great examples of, they do break down over time. They have a shelf life. So a bearing may not have a shelf life if we store it properly, but other items, absolutely, even in proper storage, they have a shelf life. And after that, you know, their effectiveness and their ability to provide value can be pretty diminished. So hopefully that answered the question. And then one of the things that you highlighted in your reply was the partnership between Machine Compare and Verison. So Ben, what does that look like, and how is that partnership providing value to our mutual customers?
So yeah, it's for us, it's really good because it's not competitive, and yet we're both working towards the same goals, which is based around, when we talk about stock optimization and we start talking about these strategies, we're really talking about sustainability. You know, we're talking about not consuming too much, making sure that what we have is what we need, and also reduction of waste. But by reduction of waste, I don't like to call the parts waste, we call them green parts. It's recirculating those parts. So it's looking at where can you source them from in a responsible way, where can we get them out to, how can we avoid everything ending up in landfill, which is ultimately bad. And if you have the blanket of all the disruption and everything and all the bad things that are happening in the world, you know, that's something that we all really want to avoid. What's good for us with Verison is that you need digital accountability in order to identify what is the true dead stock, what is the true redundant stock to be able to sell. If you speak with any engineering manager and you say, we know that you have around €250,000 worth of spare parts in your engineering stores, which could be used elsewhere, they'll all go, yeah, you're probably right. And we'll get the data and we'll look at the non-moving parts and we'll say, right, look, non-moving parts older than 2 years old, it's not a difficult equation. Pull out the critical spares and we'll start to market the rest. Most engineers will say, well, actually all of them could be critical because if this happens, I might need that. And what if that happens? They don't really want to let it go. So what you end up with is sites that go, yeah, we've got 400, 500,000, 1 million, and then you actually get down to it and you end up with nothing because, you know, you end up just with an argument of trying to get it across line because the head office will say this needs to go and this is a great product. But then when it gets down to that person, so when you deal with somebody like Verison and your technology, it brings that truth to what's there. And it's like, you actually don't need this. You can be comfortable letting go of it because you haven't used it. And not only have you not used it, but none of your other sites have used this in the last 3 years. You know, so let's let it go. Like let's let this go because somebody else out there might need it. And also by the same token, the place where it's being expedited to and they're going to help you, you're going to make money. That's going to reduce your cost of purchasing these parts that you need whilst price increases are happening, whilst everything else is going. So it's offsetting those inflationary aspects. And it's also giving you access to a pool of parts that you might otherwise find difficult to deal with. But the first starting point is we're not having that difficulty of explaining to them that it needs to go, and it definitely does. The other side of it is bringing in that kind of harmonized data first. It helps us because I think when Manjeet was talking about SAP and the data being stored in SAP, sure, you're going to have a short description, long description. You know, the table in SAP, I think, is 200 lines wide or 200 columns. The data is stored all over the place. There's no conformity to that. So if we start to get harmonized data, it's just a lot easier for us to deal with it and then enrich that because our columns are greater. You know, we can have an individual item with more than 200 attributes, you know, and if you were dealing on an SAP table, you know that they're not going to have any of that in there. They might have a data sheet if you're lucky, but they'll generally just have that high level stuff, which will be NPN number and a brand. You know, they might have categorized it. They might have categorized it wrong. They might not have even bothered categorizing it. So the relationship for us works really, really nicely. And it is just that complementary aspect to say, well, if we receive organized data that is enriched within its own data set, and then we take it and we super speed that and we get it up to OEM standard in order to market it, it makes everybody's life easy. And it actually helps the clients that are that are participating with you. because it helps them make money. It also helps them source. And so ultimately, from our perspective, it's a really, really nice relationship. And we're dealing with the same customer sets. And I think what's really key to put across here with the customers that we deal with is we can talk about how this data is poor and all the rest of it. The truth is, it's not manageable. It is not manageable on a personal level, one-to-one. Even if you put a team of 100 people on this, it's not manageable, because as soon as they've done any of this, it's obsolete straight away. They're having to input it back into the other stuff. It needs to be digital. And what we also have is there's a huge drive from these companies in order to make this better. I think the big point about this is that if you're sitting in a state where you're going, well, actually, our MRO is a mess and we probably need to do something about it, well, do something about it, because there's brilliant people working in all these big companies that have got this big drive to do that, and they're engaging with you guys, they're engaging with us. And I think it's really key to say it's not as painful as you think. The first step is almost like, come to the meeting. Like, come to the meeting, meet your sponsor, we'll have a conversation with you. It's not going to be that painful. It will get better, and time is on our side. The timing is right, the data is there, and there's also the experience of what we've been doing will also ultimately help you. And it can happen a lot quicker than you think. This isn't a 5-year roadmap. This is more of a 2 to 3 month roadmap. And that's really it.
Ben, that's a great point. I've been with Verison for about 7 months now, did a stint in the ERP supply chain technology world before coming here, and legitimately, like, projects are 12, 24, 36 months.
Yeah.
I've implemented ERPs, and this blew my mind when I came here, because what we're really talking about is, from the time you sign a contract till the time we get you on the platform and are delivering insights, right? Value, 45 to 60 days, which is really unheard of, I think, kind of in this industry and market. And then, what we're talking about are a project, if you will, in terms of implementing Verison and then our integration with Machine Compare. It doesn't require like a team of IT specialists. Like it's pretty straightforward, pretty easy to do, correct?
Yeah, and I think a really good point on that, and I'm going to jump on Manjeet's example method, is that we have a customer that gave us 51,000 lines of parts. It's a colossal amount, 51,000. These needed to be enriched in order for them to be able to be marketed. It took us just over 2 minutes, and that's not requiring anybody to go into the stores or do anything. It's just, let's put it through our system. 2 minutes later, we know exactly what we can market and what's going to sell. It's not really that difficult. So it's that obstacle. But I think, I think the one thing is we have to be good and say that there's lots of these companies engaging with us. You guys have got great brands on, so have we, and I think the partnership just works really nicely. We're excited about it, and I'm pleased that so many people have turned up for the to look at the webinar.
Yeah, thank you. So we're kind of to that point in time in our webinar. We're going to segue into a little bit of Q&A, and Baljeet, I'm going to go to you first because we've had this question in the webinar. I see it repeatedly. Shouldn't I start with direct materials? Why are you telling me to start with MRO?
Because a couple of things. One is, as we said, MRO is a little bit easier to start with because a lot of products attributes are there. It's not that much, primary focus about, quality of the product, everything, because it's all supporting the manufacturing and not going with the products kind of thing. And also, there's a lot of distribution, a lot of other channels available off the shelf type of products, and you usually don't, as long as you know the brand name like SK bearing or NSK bearing, etc., you really don't quality test every single bearing coming in kind of thing. So it's easier to start with a lot of products scattered around, a lot of overstock inventory, a lot of duplication happening within the manufacturing environment of a company, within the sister plants, right? It provides a lot of visibility. And that's, I think, is easier to start with because the risk is not that much, whereas, if you got it a one extra bearing versus, you don't have the direct material finished goods, it's totally disrupt, right? So I think the risk from the risk standpoint is there. It's actually MRO is a better way to start with. Okay.
Cool. So we actually have a couple of questions around green parts. So I'm going to throw this first to Ben, and then Baljit, if you want to jump in. So the first question, pretty straightforward. What marketing channels are used for green parts, Ben?
This is for us to be able to sell the parts, I'm guessing. So yeah, we would, obviously a lot of the groups we deal with, we're on their purchasing platforms, whether it's SAP Ariba or the like. So a lot of parts that come onto our site will instantly be pushed out to a lot of the multinational groups that look to purchase, and we'll try and fall in line with what they're looking for at that moment. So there's a way that parts get turned over really, really fast based on that. The other side is we'll look at specialist sites. So say if we had bearings, we would push those bearings to a specialist website. So if something comes to our site, I think we've got more than 30 different websites that those parts could appear on, but they would be quite specific to the category or the part they got. And also we would regionalize that as well. I think if you took bearings as an example, bearings are more likely to sell within region than externally. The main reason for that is that you can pretty much go down to your local sort of spare part shop on the industrial estate, and you can buy bearings. Like you can buy them, they're plentiful. But for us, we know that if you're trying to ship a bearing from the US to Europe, unless it's a specialist bearing, there's not really much point. The shipping would kill the price. So yeah, we would push out through Google, we'd push out through other various channels and specialist sites, and also looking at integrating with those purchasing platforms that the groups would use, because they ultimately have the largest buying power.
Cool, thank you. Along the same kind of a note, one of the questions we had was green parts really relative to the world of construction materials, specifically EPD, and the need to understand the impact of those given materials. I think you could apply this question actually broader as well. So are there any trends for aligning sustainable material sourcing from both an EPD perspective in this particular case, but I think just materials in general, and the business, product demand, current projected? Because I think sustainability, Ben, is something we talk about quite a bit between our two companies.
Yes, I can start this. A lot of what we do is we're keeping a lot of data in relation to what we've got in relation to the materials. So we're looking at the easiest thing for us to track is weights and values of what's moving around, but we will also keep a historical data in there. Now, if we start talking about sustainability, we're starting to talk about carbon, we're starting to talk about any of those materials used in those parts. That comes down to how relevant the data is from the OEMs. You've got some of the electrical suppliers like the Schneiders and those kind of people, absolutely bulletproof on that. You can get a lot of this sort of sustainability data, and you can start to see what's being moved around. When you deal with sector specific, it's more difficult to deal with, but we have been working with a few universities. Durham University was one, to try and figure out what the equation is. So I think we were looking at like Schmiel's energy at source as to where products were being made, and contact materials in those products to see what the actual environmental impact was to those products. But we are quite a long way off having a workable equation to say this is the environmental impact of these particular parts. But we can say, because we like to deal with certainty, we know the waste figures. If we can show a reduction to waste and we can show parts moving, then it's a real tangible thing. And that also ties in with ESG reporting as well, because if we create an audit trail and we can show this has happened, then that also helps companies with their sustainability objectives, and ultimately industry as well.
Awesome. All right. Well, unfortunately, we are at the end of our time this morning. I know I've learned something. Hopefully everybody else on the call has as well. I really appreciate both of you sharing your expertise and your insights. And I love that everybody stuck with us for the webinar. We will be sending out an on-demand recording. So if you want to share it with, others at your company or, peers, we would love that. And I know I can speak for all three of us when I say we're very available online. I think LinkedIn is probably the best place to find us. So Baljit, Belina, Benjamin Finley, or Christine Barnhart on LinkedIn, and we would definitely be happy to answer any additional questions. Thank you so much. I appreciate you guys being here this morning.